Benny the cat had been visiting his owner Leonardo daily ever since the old man was admitted to the hospital. This was very much against their policy, but the hospital allowed it, as it was seemingly the only thing keeping the man happy. But one doctor, Stephen, noticed that something strange was going on with this animal. Stephen was chasing the cat through the hospital halls. He was going to get a hold of this animal if it was the last thing he did. Eventually, he managed to chase Benny into a room. And when Stephen closed the door behind him, there was no way out for Benny. It did not take long before Stephen got his hands on the struggling cat. Normally, Benny was so open to affection and attention, but not before he had visited Leonardo. And now, Stephen was finally going to find out why. Benny's daily visits were not just for a quick cuddle with Leonardo. The cat was smuggling something in for the old man, and Stephen was ready to confront him with it. Benny the cat had been visiting his grumpy 85-year-old owner Leonardo every day since the old man had been admitted to the hospital. And even though this was against their policy, the hospital made an exception here due to the fact that the old man would probably never get out of here alive again. It also helped that Benny was extremely social with other patients and even hospital staff. Everybody loved the cat, and Benny lifted some people's spirits. Nobody had a problem with making an exception for the cat at first. But, as most people know, good things never seem to last at hospitals. Stephen, one of the doctors that were always on call for Leonardo, had recently started to notice something out of the ordinary. Benny began acting increasingly odd over the last few days. Where the cat had always been happy to see anyone, this slowly had started to change. It seemed like his intentions had suddenly been shifting. This whole time, Benny had wanted to be around other people all the time, but now something was very different. Whereas before, the cat came in and immediately started to socialize with everyone around, now the only thing that he seemed to look forward to was visiting Leonardo. After this visit, Benny was ready to be pet by other people in the hospital again. The truth was that this had been going on for a few days, although hardly anyone seemed to notice the change. Stephen had seen the cat hurry his way to Leonardo several times. He did not understand exactly what was happening with this cat, but it certainly was a very odd change, and the doctor felt it appropriate to start an investigation. The first thing the doctor started to wonder about was what could be happening in this room that made Benny's behavior change so much. The doctor himself was also a huge cat person, so he could observe even slight changes in a cat's behavior. Stephen thought it was impossible to change behavior so abruptly from one day to another. One thing that's widely known about cats is that they stick to their ways all the time. No matter if the ways are bad or good, they're stuck with them. Stephen really wanted to learn what happened in that room, but that was something easier said than done. Leonardo would usually ask for privacy at moments that his cat would visit. Stephen came up with the idea to follow Benny when he left the hospital. Maybe he'd be able to learn more about the cat's behavior if he knew where the cat came from. He was sure that the cat's quick behavioral change was due to something that was happening outside the hospital. Benny was a cat that was fairly easy to follow, as he was just calmly strolling down the street and rubbing against the leg of every person he came across. This creature was actually one of the nicest cats that the doctor had ever known. He was very anxious about what had happened to the poor animal, and he really wanted to make him feel better again. Eventually, the cat made it to the old house, which was about a 20-minute walk from the hospital, and it went inside through a cat door. Stephen was at first very nervous about what he was going to do, but he felt as if he didn't have any other choice. Stephen did not hesitate any longer, so he walked up to the door and rang the bell. He had no idea who was going to open that door or what right he had to actually be here. He had to make a good excuse for his presence to the stranger. But all of this didn't matter to him anymore. Stephen was just following his curiosity. He, more than anything now, wanted to know what was happening inside of this house. And as he was waiting for someone to open the door, it didn't actually happen. Nobody answered the door for him. But he knew that somebody was inside the house because he noticed that the curtains near the door were slightly moving. Someone had watched him standing there but hadn't wanted to open up to him. What reason could there be for someone not wanting Steve to be there? Stephen was sure that something was going on in there, but he didn't exactly have an idea of what it was. The sure thing was that he was going to keep a closer eye on the cat from now on, because this really made him worry about the cute animal. Therefore, his plan was to observe Benny the next time that he visited the hospital. The cat didn't come to the hospital the next day, and neither the day after. Stephen worried that he'd spooked the mysterious person inside the house, as well as that he or she would never let Benny come to the hospital ever again. He was starting to feel very guilty about everything that had been happening the day he'd followed Benny. In the coming days in which Benny didn't visit Leonardo, the patient started to get to the worst version of himself again. He was whining and being mean to everyone. He didn't ask about the cat at all, though. He was making the days of any doctor who was dealing with him a literal hell with this dreadful behavior. But then things started to clarify in the coming days. Except for his very first day in the hospital, Leonardo hadn't had any visitors at his room apart from his beloved cat. But after Stephen had gone to that creepy house and Benny had stopped visiting, somebody unknown had been starting to show up on a daily basis to visit Leonardo. Stephen got very curious about this change, and he figured out from the administration office that the visitor's name was Thomas. His name was not similar to any of Leonardo's family members, which raised a lot of questions for the hospital staff. Meanwhile, people started to notice their beloved cat's absence. The staff of the hospital had noticed the newcomer as well, though no one knew what they were talking about. This mysterious Thomas always made sure that Leonardo's door was shut tight and that the curtains were closed when he entered his room. All the nurses noticed that Leonardo did not seem much happier afterwards as opposed to after Benny's visits. Stephen one day dared to ask Thomas why he visited this man so often. Yet all he got was to be completely ignored. It was hospital protocol to respect the visitor's privacy as to what his or her relation or interest is with a patient. All that was necessary was the patient request for the person visiting, which was the case for Leonardo. There is another way to withhold a man from coming here, Stephen knew. He made the rash decision to alert security about this man, since he just knew that Thomas had to be up to no good. They were going to make sure that Leonardo's new visitor would not set foot in the building again without stating a very good reason. So how would Stephen do this? Well, the concerned doctor made up an excuse about other patients, as well as hospital visitors, complaining about the grim-looking Thomas. They apparently reported to Stephen that they felt very unsafe with him around. This was a risky move for the doctor. It could actually have implications for his job if he couldn't back this up with evidence. Stephen had an alternative motive for banning this man from the hospital, though, which could stimulate other hospital employees to back up his story. In truth, he wasn't the only one by now that had noticed the beloved Benny had stopped showing up since Thomas had began his daily visits. With that logic, it might also work the other way around. Security accepted his plea, and in the 2 days that followed, Leonardo did not get any visitors. On that first day, the patient was angry beyond belief. The situation got slightly better on that second day, on which he restored to not talking or reacting to anything or anyone that tried to communicate with him. Now for Stephen, this was interpreted as an improvement. The day-to-day life in the hospital continued, and at least people working or visiting were not distracted anymore by the presence of a shady-looking man strolling around in the halls. In addition, a quiet Leonardo was much better than a screaming one. But on the third day, things changed again. It had been pretty much exactly as Stephen had hoped for and predicted. The first noticeable entity that walked through the entrance of the hospital that morning was Benny the cat. The animal had already made quite a name for himself, and even the ones that had never seen him in real life recognized him. Benny went straight to Leonardo. Somebody from the reception at the entrance alerted Stephen right away. The doctor was lucky that he was closer to the room than Benny was at that moment. He rushed towards it and closed the door before the cat was in sight. Stephen knew that the next step would be crucial in order to discover more about this mystery. At that moment, Leonardo was still refusing to talk with anyone, which meant that he didn't complain about the door being closed either. But when Benny came closer to his friend's room and he noticed that the door was shut, he was unsure of what to do. Never had this happened in all of his visits. Before Benny had managed to figure out a way to get inside, Stephen had already snuck up behind the creature and attempted to pick up the animal. The cat was usually cuddly enough to allow this to happen, so this was probably going to be a piece of cake. However, to Stephen's surprise, Benny jolted away with sudden movements. Stephen was surprised by this action, and what followed was for him to, somewhat desperately, chase the cat through the hospital halls. The scene obviously attracted the looks of many surprised people that were around as the two passed. He knew it must have looked stupid, but he was not going to let this cat get away from him this time. After some time of chasing, Benny made the mistake of entering an empty office instead of turning into a new hallway. Stephen acted quickly, following Benny into the room, and before he could escape, the doctor had already closed the door behind him. He was now alone and face to face with the mysterious cat. Even now that he had locked up Benny in the room, it was still a big struggle for Stephen to get his hands on Benny. The first 5 times that he had tried to make his move, the only result he got were scratches everywhere and tiny bite marks on his fingers and arms. In the end, it was all worth it. He finally had an opportunity to learn more about what the hell was going on with this animal, as well as Leonardo. And perhaps he'd also figure out the mysteries regarding the house and Thomas. Even though Stephen had no idea how he was going to do this, some answers came quicker than expected. When he had Benny in a hold, he could investigate what he thought was just Benny's collar. There turned out to be much more to this object. It was clearly something custom-made for some unknown purpose. Around Benny's neck seemed to be a small compartment the size of a battery. Stephen figured out that a lock around the cat's neck was holding everything together. When the doctor found out that the click system worked to take it off, Benny's whole demeanor changed instantly. The marvelous creature became its calm and affectionate self again that everybody in the hospital had loved so much before. Stephen, step by step, started to understand what had been happening in his hospital. Benny, very plausibly, was being trained to bring this object to Leonardo for whatever reason. The doctor had seen that the moment the collar had been taken off, the cat knew that he could do what he wanted again. However, not all questions had been answered yet. Most things actually still remained a big mystery for Stephen. Why was this happening? Who had done this to Benny? After letting the cat roam through the hospital halls again, Stephen started inspecting the compartment he'd just taken from the animal. Soon, he managed to open it. Stephen's eyes went wide open when he saw that was inside. Of course. It suddenly all made sense to him now. His first instinct was to immediately run into Leonardo's room to confront him. The fact that this man had exploited Sweet Benny made him quite angry. But Stephen knew he had to play it smart. Considering the white powder that was on the inside of the compartment, Stephen knew that it'd be best to get the police involved in all of this first. The case needed to be solved correctly and not single-handedly or out of his own emotions. From that moment on, everything went very quickly. A police team first got into contact with Thomas that was visiting Leonardo when Benny had not shown up. Fortunately, there was not much effort and time needed to confirm Stephen's suspicions. Thomas knew all too well that there was no more ways out of this, and he confirmed the narrative that the police had predicted as well. The next step for the team was to go ahead to the house where Stephen had seen Benny get in one time when he followed him. Again, nobody would answer the door, but it didn't stop the police this time. The house had actually already been on a list of suspicious houses, and since Stephen was involved, they now had an official house warrant. The door was quickly broken down by a specialist team, and the 2 men that had been hiding inside were arrested on the spot. When Stephen heard this the next day, he expected the 2 suspects to be family members of Leonardo, but they turned out to be his accomplices. As the point of contact of the hospital, Stephen was quickly notified of the arrest. The police found a bunch of illegal items, of which the police couldn't share the details yet. They did share, however, that the two people inside had given their statements and that their stories aligned. This meant that there was now enough evidence to proceed with the investigation and confront Leonardo as well. When Stephen and two policemen of the investigation got to Leonardo's room, the old man was screaming again. This time he was really at the top of his lungs. Still, well, whatever he was angry about right now could not be half as bad as what the police were about to inform him on. The moment the officers walked into the room, Leonardo immediately went wide in shock and horror. There was no doubt that he knew what this was about. Probably he'd been afraid of this already, since the days that he'd been visited were less often. Now, he knew he was busted and there wasn't much he could do about it. The substance that Dr. Stephen had found inside the compartment that had been part of the collar of Benny had in the meantime been identified. It was a white powder that probably didn't take a genius to determine what it was, but obviously the police wanted to know for sure. Old Leonardo and his accomplices had been using Benny this whole time to sneak the product into the hospital to feed his addiction, which he couldn't otherwise get while he was being admitted. Still, it was not only Leonardo who was getting it. Stephen couldn't believe it as the story unfolded. Apparently, the old man was a dealer, and Thomas, together with the two arrested persons from the house, were working and selling for Leonardo. The evidence was unmistakable now, and funnily enough, it had all been set in motion after winning the chasing game against Benny. Leonardo was soon transported to a prison hospital and is now awaiting trial. New test results indicate that he has a couple more years to live than the doctors earlier predicted. Although now perhaps he isn't necessarily happy with this diagnosis. The three accomplices are waiting trial as well, leaving Benny without anybody to take care of him. But now, after all that the cat's been through, Stephen feels that it's only right that he adopt the famous animal. He has freed Benny from criminals, and he feels as if the cat understands this. Moreover, now he can take Benny with him to the hospital many more times, so that the cat can keep interacting with all his new friends.